Most of us like to think our imaginations are without boundaries, without limits, that we can envision anything being possible. And in my experience, particularly as a parent and an advocate, that hasn't necessarily always been true. In fact, that there are many times in which we have limited the possibilities for people simply because we haven't challenged our imaginations sufficiently. So I'm with a sister organization. It's the Alberta Association for Community Living. It's a family advocacy organization that was begun over 50 years ago by parents, primarily by mothers, actually. It's important to acknowledge our roots. And I will speak to you today largely as a parent, but of course our movement in Canada, to the degree it's been successful, is clearly not only because families are at the heart of that movement, at least as we see it, but because we've had allies from every corner of our community that have stood with us. But it is our perspective that not only are families at the heart of our communities, but in fact they are the cornerstone to creating inclusive lives and to in fact transforming communities at least to a much greater degree than has been true lately, such that our communities embrace inclusion, welcome people with disabilities, and notice, in fact, when they're not present and the diminishment of that community as a result. Now, as parents, we are, in fact, transformed through love. To the degree that love is the basis for our movement and effort to create change. And part of that transformation, I think many of us go through as parents, is that having a child with disabilities enables us to see the world differently. And in seeing the world differently, we're then required to act on it accordingly. What we thought was important before we had a child with disabilities has changed. We may see vulnerabilities in people that we hadn't previously seen and understood. We may, in fact, reconsider the importance and value of relationships in people's lives and in friendships, and what it means to be lonely and excluded and isolated and segregated. And so we are, in fact, I think, transformed by these vulnerabilities, those of ourselves, in our worry, fear, and apprehension. What will this mean to me as a family? As a parent, what will my child's future look like? What happens to my child when I'm no longer here? You know, the perpetual question that all parents are faced with from the moment of having a child with disabilities. You know, the fact that I would do anything humanly possible to prevent my child from feeling rejected or alone or having the experience of being denied an opportunity, but in fact I can't do that. So you live with that vulnerability as a parent. And in fact, I think it's those vulnerabilities that have so much to do with the change we're trying to address collectively. So I'm going to suggest a few things that we need to do. One is that I think we're required to have an ever-empowering and expanding vision. The point really is to suggest that we ought to the degree possible, remove whatever boundaries we've set on those possibilities and continually challenge ourselves. Most of us as parents have had that experience where we've been surprised by things our sons and daughters have been able to accomplish that we ourselves hadn't imagined, even when we thought we had the most positive perspective of their abilities and possibilities. And so it's incumbent upon us to be open, to be challenged with respect to our vision, what the future might look like, and to find ways to expand that vision. In my view, in fact, an inclusive life, or the continual pursuit of that to the degree possible, is the only way to create a life of meaning, belonging, and unimagined possibilities. So most of us, I think, especially an organization like this that's been committed to inclusion for some time, has held the belief of the importance for children to be able to grow up at home, to be included in school, to have friends, participate in community activities, be a teenager and annoy your parents to the nth degree, have dreams and wishes, traveling to Europe, falling in love, getting a job. When you choose inclusion, it can many times break your heart and wound your soul, at least at times. So to choose inclusion, in fact, is to make the harder choice, the better choice, I believe, but the much harder choice, because you will experience rejection, denial, challenges, and barriers in the interests of the love and passion that you have for your son and daughter, and that should not deter us. We have many positive individual stories of inclusion, in fact, many thousands, if not tens of thousands, of examples of inclusion today, whether it be school or recreation or community or employment. Even with all of these large numbers of very positive individual examples, still an inclusive life, at least in Canada, and perhaps it's different in Australia and New South Wales, it is not an ordinary life. It's not something a child with disabilities or a person with disabilities can expect to pursue ordinarily. It's one that requires families standing behind them to make sure that possibility does exist. We thought that if enough children were being included in school, the culture of schools would change. there'd be sort of like this tipping point, and that one day school administrators and bureaucracies and districts and professionals and special educators would all wake up and say, aha, I've been wrong for the last 100 years. All of our commitment to special education and segregation was not only a poor idea, but a very harmful and detrimental idea. And from now on, we're going to make a commitment to inclusion. We have rarely seen that. Initially, when we began this journey of inclusion, we had momentary examples of inclusion in people's lives. We could point to times where they're being included. Now we have, of course, generations of kids that are growing up inclusively. But still, that hasn't resulted in the kind of systemic change that we would like to see. So our challenge is not only, I think, to change lives, but to also change communities. And changing communities, I think, is a function of a slightly larger vision that goes beyond our individual children and simply beyond them having inclusive lives. It's about collective action that is mobilizing together the hundreds of families in this room, the thousands of families in the Alberta Association for Community Living, and in fact, the mobilization of community capacity. We're currently living in a crisis in Alberta, although we are moving forward on the inclusive front, I think, quite successfully. Our crisis is a labor force shortage across the board. No industry, no business can find sufficient people, irrespective of the money they have to pay for salaries, to fill all the positions. Now, when you put into that equation supports for people with disabilities and the dependency we've created for people to have personalized supports in order to have a good life, you can begin to imagine what that crisis looks like. Where we've built a system, as we have in Canada, where the quality of people's lives and their degree of inclusion is built on human labor, we've now broached the limits of that. Without community assuming its shared responsibility, without them experiencing the wonder and value of having people with disabilities as an inherent part of their natural lives, we will be dependent on human services, and we will therefore limit the future for people with disabilities as we are in various parts of the world. And in particular, we've focused our energies now as a family organization on the community itself, and have really, in fact, distanced ourselves, and this is open to argument, from the human service field, and really see ourselves in alliance and partnership and forming a greater number of those with the generic community, and using the networking and the connections that are being developed through this process to in fact gauge the ordinary citizen, if you want, and create inclusive possibilities. So we're trying to take the transformative experience we've had of being a parent of a child with disabilities and give that as a gift, if you want. It's not always perceived that way, of course. But when we see it that way, we are not asking the community to include our sons and daughters. We are providing them with a distinct benefit that they need. We are, in many ways, creating better communities, as I'll attempt to illustrate for you. And as they see this, okay, they become themselves, and we're seeing that in our province today. It's quite phenomenal as a parent to have business people and others getting up on their own and advocating for inclusion in all kinds of places of the world that they walk in that I will never, in fact, enter. And of course, they have a different voice than we have as families. Kyle was born, he had very little hope of survival. He was significantly premature, but had some tenacity, hung on, got rid of all the tubes, etc. Is quite small at the time, has cognitive disabilities and is visually impaired, but has had a fully inclusive life as well. It's great through these experiences. His parents were pretty sure the coaches would talk to him and just see this wasn't being possible. First of all, Kyle's not aggressive. Wasn't particularly strong. They didn't know how they were going to cope with his disappointment. This was their trauma. We're going to go, we're going to take him, he's going to meet people, they're going to say, no, this won't work, it's not possible. And so the coach spent some time with Kyle, figured a way to talk to him, because he'd say to Kyle, you want to go have a Coke? I don't drink Coke. Or some chips, Kyle's very fussy, I don't eat chips. Do you drink water? And Kyle said yes. The coach said, okay, then we have something to talk about. And his mom says, I should have known then they were going to make this work. No one typically thinks of a child who almost died at birth, really struggled to survive, legally can't see, in fact, right, has intellectual disabilities, getting out on a football field where people tackle each other at great passion, speed, in an attempt to, hurt each other almost, in a way. And here he is playing football. Now, not only have these coaches made this work, they talk about how they've transformed. I mean, we've had them come and talk publicly about their doubts about this, about how the team has gelled as a result of Kyle's participation and presence, how it's changed their idea of what's really important, and the subtlety with which they provide support. Nobody teaches them this. Nobody tells them to do it. You've all seen it before in inclusive environments, right? Put a hand on his shoulder so he'll know when to run out onto the field, for example. Kyle can't take off his helmet, so they straighten out his helmet for him, again, very subtly, without other people knowing. No one asked them. So Kyle is changing lives and changing communities. And we can continue to do that through the clarity of our vision, our commitment to inclusion, and our collective, organized grassroots action.